wherever it was that he went, he always ended up hanging with the wrong bunch of people. You see them with their Manchester United tops on. You'll see Stevie Waters and Tommy Roundtree there, and you're like, no, we don't want to go there, because you always you will then get typecast. If you're in the wrong crowd, then it doesn't matter who you are. The reason that you're standing there, you're automatically assumed as being part of that crowd. And Jesus had this way of always being with the wrong types of people. He always had this way of being a part and being attached to the wrong crowd. And so he got this reputation of being a friend of sinners. It was a reputation that Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, had got for his life. He's nothing but a friend of sinners. And so there's this one time that we've just read in Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus sees Matthew at a tax collector's booth, and he's sitting at the booth. Now, the thing that you've got to understand here about the context is that Matthew is a Jewish man in the nation of Israel. And 2,000 years ago, concerning the time that this is being written about, the nation of Israel is under the occupation of the Roman Empire. And the Jewish nation hated the fact that they were being occupied by this force, that they were being occupied by Rome. They hated it. They hated the Romans being there. They hated the Roman army. They hated how the Romans treated them. Very, very poorly, to say the least. And yet you have Matthew, this Jewish man, who's sitting at a tax collector's booth, collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire. That's the context of this. So whenever you're thinking about Jesus and who Jesus is going to call, the last person that Jesus would want to call would be someone like Matthew, because he's collecting taxes for the enemy. Not only that, the tax collectors were either paid very, very little or weren't paid anything at all. And so they had to produce their own income. And so what they would do is they would add some extra. They would add a percentage onto what had to be collected in. So if you're coming up as a Jewish person and you're paying your taxes, then Matthew would say, no, you don't owe £10, you owe £12, and Matthew would pocket a couple of quid for himself. And the Jewish people knew this was going on, but there was nothing that they could do about it. So Matthew is both in some way hated by his own people because he's collecting taxes for the enemy. So you imagine if you're a Jew in the nation of Israel at that time, how would you feel about Matthew collecting taxes and stealing from you on behalf of the Romans, on behalf of the enemy? Matthew was a man that had very little or no friends. He was hated by his own people, probably even disowned by his own family, because they seen him as a sellout. You've sold us up the river, Matthew. You've sold us short here. You're stealing from us. So he was in some way hated and disowned by his own people. But he wouldn't even have had any friends within the Romans, because the Romans had no love for the Jewish people. The Romans had no love for anybody except for themselves. And Matthew's sitting at this tax collector's booth, and it's here where Jesus comes up to him and begins to call him. Matthew would be the last person that a Jewish rabbi would want to call because of the circumstances, because of the job that he's doing and what that entails, because of the context of the situation. And yet this is who Jesus calls. He's always involved in the wrong crowd. And yet he comes up to Matthew and he says, Matthew, follow me. Follow me. As any Jewish boy or Jewish man, whatever age, the words that you would want to hear from a Jewish rabbi would be the words, follow me. Let me explain why. Within the nation of Israel, you had this Jewish school. We'll not get into the details, but let me explain this. There were approximately 3 levels within this school. And every Jewish boy would enroll in the school. And the goal, the dream, the vision for your life was to get through every stage, to get through every level, and to graduate at the highest level, and to have a rabbi come to you, a Jewish teacher, and say to you, follow me. So what would happen is, it was all revolving around, at the start, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It wasn't called the Old Testament to them. It was just their Jewish writings, their ancient writings, their history, their law. And so the first 5 books in the Old Testament are books of law. And so as you came into this school, you would have to read through the books of law. And then there would come a stage where you would have to memorize the first 5 books. And if you weren't able to memorize the first 5 books of the law, then you were sent home. You were taken out of the school. You didn't graduate onto the next level. And you had to go home. And what would happen was you would either start up your own business or you would go into the family business. If you did graduate, then you went on to the next level. And by the end of it, what you would have to do is you would have to recite, you would have to memorize, read through and memorize the whole of the Old Testament, all of the ancient Jewish writings. You had to memorize them. And what your dream was is you wanted to get to that stage at the age of about 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever age it was. And your dream was to have everything memorized, to be able to recite everything as a young Jewish man, as a young Jewish male. And then for a rabbi to look at you and to say, you know what? He's got something. He's good. I like that boy. I'm going to get him to be one of my disciples. And so rabbis would go about looking for the best of the best. And they would go up, they would find someone that they knew, yeah, you know what, you're good. You're good. Follow me. And that would be the dream of every Jewish male, to be able to follow in the footsteps of a rabbi, to learn under him, to develop under him, to learn everything that he knows, and then to go on to be a rabbi yourself. And so what we have happening here, Jesus is calling disciples. He is looked upon as a Jewish rabbi. There's debate as to whether he's the Messiah, whether he's the Son of God or not. But people recognize him as being a teacher and of being a Jewish rabbi. And so he goes to, first of all, Peter and Andrew and James and John, 2 sets of brothers. What are they doing? They're fishing. They haven't graduated from the school. They're rejects from the Jewish school. They didn't make it. They weren't good enough. And these are the ones that he calls. And then of all people, Matthew, a tax collector, collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans. And this is the next one. Jesus goes up and Jesus says, Matthew, follow me. Matthew would have seen Jesus in action. This was not a case, sometimes whenever you grow up in church and you come up in Sunday school and you hear these, that Jesus went to Peter and Andrew and James and John and he said, follow me, and they just left everything and they didn't even know who Jesus was. No, they would have seen Jesus in action. In fact, it was Andrew that introduced Peter to Jesus. It was Andrew that went to Peter, his brother, and said, you know what? I think this man could be the Messiah. And he brought Peter to Jesus. And then Jesus says, follow me. And they see Jesus as being the Messiah, and that's why they're thinking, yeah, you could be the one that the Old Testament is talking about, that the Old Testament scriptures, that the books of prophecy are talking about. We're going to follow you. Even though they were rejects, these are the ones that Jesus was calling. And so he goes to Matthew, another reject, now collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans, and he says to Matthew, follow me. This was a dream come true for Matthew. Matthew probably would have thought, you know what? My time is gone. Nobody's going to want me anymore. Nobody's going to be calling my name anymore. And yet Jesus goes up to him as he's sitting at his tax booth. And Jesus says, Matthew, follow me. Follow me. These were the words that Matthew wanted to hear. Of all the people but that Jesus could have called, he called Peter and Andrew and James and John, and now he's calling Matthew. And you talk about, a crazy bunch of people that Jesus calls together. How about this for a bit of context? Peter and Andrew, James and John were fishermen. And this is all taking place in the northern part of Israel around the Sea of Galilee, around a town called Capernaum, where a lot of Jesus' ministry took place. And Peter and Andrew and James and John, they're from this little town called Capernaum, and they would bring their fish in. And as they brought their fish ashore, then they would have had to have paid taxes to someone. And the person that they're paying the taxes to, they know they're paying this to the Romans, which they don't like. But not only that, the person that they're paying the taxes to is stroking them on the side. Peter and Andrew and James and John knew who Matthew was. They had to have done, because it wasn't that big of a town. And Matthew being a tax collector, Peter and Andrew and James and John were paying taxes to Matthew. Can you imagine what was being spoken about there? Because Jesus has already called the 2 sets of brothers. And they're following him. They're thinking, yeah, we're following Jesus. And then the next thing that Jesus does is he goes and he calls Matthew. Could you imagine the talk that's going on between Andrew and Peter and James and John? Does he know what he's doing? Does he know who this guy is? He's not just standing at a tax booth to make it look good. He's Matthew, the tax collector. He's the tax collector. Can you imagine the talk that's going on? Jesus is calling Matthew. Why is he calling Matthew? Why? Of all the people, sometimes we forget as Christians what we have been called out of and what we have been called from. And sometimes even we can get on our high horses and think, you, yes, you, and you, anybody. And this is proof that it can be anybody, because Jesus calls them and they begin to follow him. Here's the crazy thing, and I'm going to be done very, very soon. Matthew moves. Matthew moves. Matthew is sitting behind the tax booth. This is where he worked. This is where he placed his identity. This was his source of income. This is where you would find him every day. This was his place of comfort. This is where Matthew had come to, and this was his life now. His life was a tax collector. And it's from here, it's from this position that Jesus calls him. And Matthew now has a choice to make. Does he stay or does he follow Jesus? Does he leave this place of comfort, this place where he has become used to? And does he keep on with this? This is what he knows. This is what he's known for quite some time. And even though he may be talked about, even though he may not have many friends, even though he may be disowned yet, this is where he has placed his identity. We don't know how Matthew has got here. We don't know the process and the situations that have led him up to being here. All we know is that Matthew was a tax collector, despised and rejected by his own family and friends and his own people. Yet this is where he is. This is the snapshot that we get of Matthew's life. For a lot of people, what we would do is we would take a photograph of Matthew at the tax collector's booth, and they would put it up on Facebook. And we begin to talk about him and ridicule him and put him down and call him names on Facebook. And this is the one that Jesus calls. And Matthew now has a choice to make. This is where I have my identity. This is what I'm used to. This is what I'm comfortable with. This is all I've ever known. And Jesus is now calling me into something that I don't know. What do I do? Matthew now has a choice to make. What will he do? Will he stay or will he follow Jesus? Just prior to Jesus calling Matthew, from Matthew chapter 9, the very start that we read there, it says, and Jesus went on from there. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, we picked it up from. Jesus went on from there. Went on from where? Just prior to Jesus calling Matthew, there's a situation that takes place where Jesus is preaching in a house. And there are these crowds that have gathered around the house, so it's very difficult to get into the house. And these men turn up at the meeting, and they've got a friend with them, and their friend is paralyzed. And what they do in order to get their friend to Jesus, they go up onto the roof of the house, and they cut away, they pull away the roof of the house, and they begin to lower their friend down. He's paralyzed, he cannot move, and they lower him down at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus heals the man. The man was paralyzed. He was lowered down on a mat, on a bed, at the feet of Jesus. But he walks out of the house. He is freed from what he was paralyzed from. And if we fast forward to Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. This is where all of us at one time have been, or where we are. It's this moment of opportunity. It's this moment between, do we stay where we are? Do we stay with what we're comfortable with? Do we stay with the same group of friends that we have? Do we stay doing the same things that we've always done? Do we stay here because this is where our identity is shaped? This is where I can fit my identity in here. So this is what I'm known as. I'm known as Matthew the tax collector. This is the person that I'm known as. But there is this moment of opportunity, this moment that we can move from where we are into what God is calling us to be and who God is calling us to be. And Matthew has a choice to make, like we all have a choice to make. Do we stay or do we answer the call? And sometimes what happens is we become paralyzed. We become paralyzed by fear. We become paralyzed because of fear of the unknown, because this is what we know. So do we stay here or do we go? I don't know what's down there. I don't know what's going to happen. I've never been down that road before. This is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I know. There is fear down there, but so I'm going to stay here because it's easier. I know that that's the way to go, but this is what I know. Spend a lot of time talking with a lot of young men. I will talk to them about God. And the response is very often this: I believe Jesus was the Son of God. I believe that I need to be a Christian. I want to go to church, but. And then they begin to talk about that which has got them paralyzed. I can't because I don't want to give up my weekends of drinking. I don't want to give up my weekends of drugs. I don't want to give up my weekends of parties. If I become a Christian, then that means I've got to stop doing this. If I become a Christian, then that means I've got to give up this. Let me tell you something. Please listen. If you don't hear anything that I say today, then hear this one thing. Christianity is not about the things that you have to give up. It's about that which you get. And if you only knew, you would run. You would run from this position. You would run from that place of being in that tax booth. And you would run to Jesus. Nothing would hold you back. Nothing would hold you paralyzed. Nothing would capture you behind that tax booth. Matthew understood that. There would have been fear within Matthew because he knows these guys don't like me because I stole from them. I've robbed them. I remember one time whenever we were down in Townsend Street, and this guy had come to preach one night. It was a midweek meeting, and the guy was the head of a building company, and he was building in the local area. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a thing called protection money that happens within this road. And the builder was paying protection money to someone. And this someone had become a Christian and was in our church. And at one stage was taking protection money from the builder who had come to preach in our church last night. And he comes to me and says, Johnny, I used to take protection money from him. What'll it do? And I'm like, you got to introduce yourself. You got to say sorry. And it was all good. It was all okay. And this is what this would have been like because Matthew was taking money from Peter and Andrew and James and John. And yet these are the men that Jesus calls. And Matthew doesn't allow himself to be paralyzed. He gets up and he walks to Jesus and he follows Jesus. He leaves everything behind because he's not fussed anymore about this which is holding him captive and destroying his life. And he goes to Jesus. And so many people in this place have done that. And maybe you're here today and you're sitting at this tax booth and Jesus is calling you to move. This is what he does. He has called many people. He called Peter and Andrew and James and John. Leave your fishing business. Come and follow me. They left and they went and they followed Jesus. You know what's crazy is there's a story in Matthew. I think it's chapter 19. And give me 5 more minutes and we'll be done. I think it's Matthew chapter 19. Let me get this right. And there's a rich young man and he goes to Jesus. And he asked Jesus about following him. He says, I want to follow you. What have I got to do to inherit eternal life? And what have I got to do to follow you? In Matthew chapter 19 and from verse 21, Jesus responds to him and he says, okay, you got to obey the commandments. And the man says, yes, I've done that there. And Jesus says, all right, sell everything you've got and come and follow me. And the Bible says in Matthew chapter 19 that he couldn't do that. And he went away sorrowful. He went away with his head down, shaking his head, because he knew, I want to follow Jesus, but I'm being paralyzed by my own wealth. As we read through the Bible, here we are, 2,000 years later, talking about this man, Matthew, who left everything and followed Jesus. We've just read from his biography on the life of Jesus. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him. We don't know who the rich young man was. We never hear anything else about him. He disappears into history. And there are many throughout history who have taken up the call to follow Jesus. We talk about Peter. We talk about Andrew. We talk about James and John. We talk about many. We talk about Moses, who left everything, who left the comfort of Midian and went back to Egypt to deliver his people, to deliver the people of God, the Israelites, from the hand of the Egyptians, from slavery, and to take them into their own land. They all had to get up from their tax booth and follow Jesus. And with this, I will close. You've got to get up and you've got to move. Jesus' response to the Pharisees was, It's not the healthy that need a doctor. You see, you don't go and see a doctor. Well, some do. They're called hypochondriacs. None in this place. But when we're sick, then we think about picking up the phone. I've got to make an appointment to see the doctor. We never do that whenever we're healthy. We never even think about the doctors. We never think about the GPs. We never think about the hospitals. We're just, because we're healthy, it's not on our mind. And then all of a sudden we're sick and we know, I need a doctor. And Jesus is talking about the spiritual health of his nation at the time. He's talking about the spiritual health of people. And Jesus knows spiritually they're not healthy. And that's why he called, see, the problem with the Pharisees, they were religious. It's about do this and do this and do this. And whenever you do this and do this and do this, then you will be right with God, or then you will be okay. That's not Christianity. Christianity is about who you are in God. It's about your identity in Christ. And so Jesus doesn't call us to become religious. He doesn't call us to fall into a set of rules and regulations. He sets us free. He sets us free, and he gives us life. And what an incredible life. You know the amazing thing about people that get saved who have come from that lifestyle of drink and of drugs and of parties and paramilitaries and whatever it is that they have come from, who have come from a messed up background. Do you know that whenever they get saved, do you know the one thing that they always say, that everybody says? Wish they'd have done it sooner. Wish they'd have done it sooner. Because they come to that point where they realize that stuff that had them paralyzed and stuck in the text booth was not worth holding on to. And whenever they take that step away from the text booth and into Jesus, then they realize, I wish they'd have done this sooner, because this is amazing. I want to encourage you to get the courage to leave whatever it is that you need to leave behind, because Jesus is calling you today. The Holy Spirit is calling you today in this place to step up from where you are and to make a move towards Jesus. And I can guarantee you, it'll be the best decision you will ever make in your life. You will not regret it. You will not regret it.